The meteorologists called it the Siberian Express, a catastrophic low-pressure system destined to bury the Colorado Rockies under 6 feet of snow. But for 32-year-old Sarah Jenkins, the impending whiteout wasn't just a weather event. It was an execution order. Forced out of her remote cabin by a vindictive ex-fiancé with nothing but a canvas rucksack and the clothes on her back, she had less than 4 hours of daylight to find shelter in an unforgiving, freezing wilderness. What began as a desperate, gasping scramble for survival soon transformed into a brutal masterclass of human endurance. Before the ice thawed, the mountain would try to break her. Instead, it built her. The click of the deadbolt echoing through the frosted timber of the cabin was the loudest sound Sarah had ever heard. It possessed a horrifying finality. She stood on the wooden porch, the soles of her hiking boots already transferring the biting cold of the wooden planks straight into her bones. Through the thick, double-paned glass of the front window, she could see David Caldwell, the man she had planned to marry, turning his back to her. He didn't even pause to watch her leave. He simply walked back to the stone fireplace, stoking the glowing embers, securing himself in the warmth of the home they had renovated together. Legally, his name was the only one on the deed, a formality he had called it a year ago. Today, it was the weapon he used to end her. The eviction notice had been served with cruel precision. It was November 18th. The skies above the San Juan Mountains were already bruised with a sickly violet hue, a heavy overcast that blocked out the midday sun. The temperature hovered at a deceptive 28 degrees Fahrenheit, but the wind chill was rapidly dropping. Sarah adjusted the straps of her olive-drab canvas backpack. It was heavily loaded, but utterly insufficient for what lay ahead. In the 15 minutes David had granted her to vacate, she had scrambled like a cornered animal. She possessed a carbon steel hatchet, a magnesium fire starter, a heavy-duty waterproof tarp, a sub-zero sleeping bag, 3 cans of kidney beans, a first aid kit, and a single canteen of water. Her truck, an old rusted Ford, sat dead in the driveway. The alternator had conveniently failed 2 days prior. David had known the truck wouldn't start. He had known the nearest town, the small mining outpost of Silverton, was a 14-mile hike down a treacherous, winding mountain pass. 14 miles, she whispered to herself, her breath pluming in the frigid air. If she maintained a brisk pace, she could cover maybe 3 miles an hour. But the road was already slick with black ice, and the elevation change was brutal. Furthermore, the radio warnings from the morning echoed in her mind. A historic blizzard warning is in effect. Whiteout conditions expected by nightfall. Travel is strictly prohibited. Sarah turned away from the cabin, her jaw set so tightly her teeth ached. Panic fluttered in her chest, a trapped bird battering against her ribs, but she forced it down. Panic was a luxury she couldn't afford. She had to move. The first 2 miles were a blur of adrenaline and heartbreak. The gravel road crunched beneath her boots, a rhythmic, monotonous sound that synchronized with her beating heart. She replayed the argument in her head, the sudden, explosive fight over his mounting debts, the revelation of his lies, and then the chilling, dead-eyed calmness with which he handed her the pre-prepared legal document. He had planned this. He had waited for the weather to turn, ensuring her departure would be as punishing as possible. By the 3rd mile, the adrenaline began to curdle, replaced by a creeping, insidious numbness in her fingers and toes. The wind began to howl, no longer a distant whisper, but a physical force rushing through the canyon, tearing at her wool coat. The first flakes of snow began to fall. They weren't the soft, picturesque flakes of a holiday card. They were hard, granular pellets of ice that stung her cheeks like birdshot. Sarah checked her watch. It was 3:15 p.m. The sky was darkening rapidly, the bruised purple fading into an oppressive, leaden gray. The mountains around her, usually a source of breathtaking beauty, now loomed like jagged teeth closing in. She had covered roughly 4 miles. Silverton was still 10 miles away. She was losing the light. The temperature was plummeting toward the single digits, and the snowfall was intensifying by the minute, quickly obscuring the road ahead. She stopped, her chest heaving, the icy air burning her lungs with every inhalation. A terrifying realization washed over her, cold and absolute. I am not going to make it to town. If she stayed on the exposed road, when the blizzard fully hit, the wind chill would drop to 30 below zero. She would freeze to death on the asphalt long before sunrise. Her body just another tragic headline for the spring thaw. She had to abandon the road. She needed a windbreak, a depression in the earth, a cluster of dense pines, anything to get out of the direct assault of the incoming storm. She looked to her left. The terrain dropped off into a steep, heavily wooded ravine. To her right, a rocky incline rose sharply, peppered with ancient, twisted juniper trees and massive limestone outcroppings. Choosing the high ground to avoid being trapped in a snowdrift at the bottom of a ravine, Sarah veered off the road. She plunged into the knee-high brush, her boots slipping on frost-covered rocks as she scrambled up the embankment, leaving the only path to civilization behind her. The ascent was brutal. Within 20 minutes, Sarah's thighs were burning, and a dangerous sweat had broken out across her back, a death sentence in sub-zero temperatures if she stopped moving and the moisture froze. The snowfall was no longer a flurry. It was a curtain of blinding white. The wind shrieked through the pines, a deafening roar that sounded almost human in its fury. She navigated by touch as much as by sight, dragging herself upward from tree trunk to boulder, her eyes scanning the rock faces for an overhang. She needed a microclimate, a space where the Earth's natural thermal mass could shield her. Just as her left boot gave way on a patch of scree, sending her sliding backward to her knees, she saw it. About 50 yards up a steep, jagged scree field was a dark fissure in the pale limestone wall. It looked like a slash in the side of the mountain, framed by two gnarled roots of a dead ponderosa pine. It wasn't large, perhaps 3 feet wide and 5 feet tall, but it was utterly dark inside, suggesting depth. Summoning the last reserves of her strength, Sarah crawled up the loose rocks. Her leather gloves tore on the sharp edges of the limestone, but she didn't feel the cuts. She reached the entrance and collapsed against the stone, gasping for air. The air immediately outside the fissure was violently turbulent, but as she peered into the blackness, she noticed something miraculous. The wind didn't penetrate. She unclipped her flashlight from her pack, her fingers stiff and uncooperative. She clicked it on, the beam cutting through the gloom. The cave narrowed for the first few feet before opening up into a surprising chamber, roughly 10 feet wide and 8 feet deep. The ceiling was low, forcing her to stoop, but it was dry. The floor was a mixture of pulverized rock, dry dirt, and decades of accumulated pine needles blown in from outside. It smelled of ancient dust, dry rot, and faintly of an animal's musk, a musky feral scent that made the hairs on her arms stand up. She drew her hatchet, the beam of her light sweeping the corners. No bones, no fresh scat, no sleeping bear. It appeared abandoned. "Okay," Sarah whispered into the hollow silence. "Okay, this is it." She stepped fully inside. The difference was staggering. The shrieking wind outside was instantly muted to a low, hollow moan. The ambient temperature, while still freezing, lacked the wind chill that had been slicing through her coat. But relief was a dangerous trap. She couldn't just sit down. She needed to establish a hearth, and she had perhaps 40 minutes before the blizzard would make stepping outside impossible. Sarah dropped her pack and immediately went back to work. She pushed back out into the raging storm, her eyes squinting against the stinging snow. She scrambled around the entrance of the cave, frantic. She needed fuel. The mountain was generous in this regard. Deadfall from the surrounding pines littered the slope. She gathered armfuls of dry, snapping branches, prioritizing wood that was sheltered under the larger trees and hadn't yet been soaked by the snow. She made 6 trips, moving with a manic, singular focus, until her muscles screamed in protest. She piled the wood inside the cave, creating a massive, chaotic mound against the back wall. Next, she took her hatchet and hacked away at the lower branches of the pine trees, gathering huge, fragrant bundles of green pine boughs. By the time she dragged the last load of boughs inside, the daylight was entirely gone. The world outside the cave entrance was a swirling, chaotic vortex of impenetrable darkness and white snow. The storm had arrived in full force. Sarah sat on the dirt floor, her chest heaving, the adrenaline finally beginning to ebb. In its wake came the cold, a deep, pervasive ache that settled into her joints. She was shivering violently now, her teeth chattering so hard her jaw clamped down in spasms. Fire. Now. She cleared a small circle near the center of the cave, careful to keep it away from the back wall, to allow the smoke to draft toward the entrance. She laid down a bed of dry pine needles, then shaved delicate, curly slivers of wood from a dry branch using her hatchet. With trembling hands, she took out her magnesium starter. She struck the flint. A shower of sparks rained down, but the needles only smoldered. "Come on," she begged, her voice cracking. "Please." She struck it again. And again. On the fourth strike, a brilliant white spark caught the edge of a wood shaving. A tiny fragile tongue of orange flame licked upward. Sarah dropped to her stomach, her face inches from the dirt, and blew on it softly, coaxing it, nursing it like a newborn. The flame caught the pine needles, flaring up with a sudden, beautiful crackle. She added tiny twigs, then larger branches, until a robust, steady fire pushed back the oppressive darkness of the cave. The golden light danced across the jagged limestone walls, casting long, shifting shadows. The heat radiated outward, touching her frozen cheeks. It was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. Sarah spent the next hour building her bed. She layered the green pine boughs, nearly a foot thick, on the stone floor to insulate her body from the earth, which would otherwise siphon away her body heat in the night. She laid her heavy tarp over the boughs, then unrolled her sleeping bag on top. Sitting cross-legged on her makeshift bed, she finally allowed herself to stop. She opened a can of kidney beans, eating them cold with her hunting knife, the metallic taste of the tin mixing with the starchy beans. Outside, the wind shrieked like a choir of the damned, a relentless, terrifying assault against the mountain. Inside, the fire popped and hissed. Sarah looked at the dancing flames, the reality of her situation finally settling over her like a suffocating blanket. She was miles from civilization, trapped in a hole in the earth, with no communications, meager supplies, and a historic blizzard raging outside. David had cast her out to die. The mountain was indifferent to her existence. Tears finally welled in her eyes, hot and stinging, but she angrily wiped them away with the back of her dirty glove. She looked at her sturdy boots, her hatchet resting by the fire, the solid rock wall surrounding her. "You thought the cold would kill me, David," she whispered to the empty cave, her voice steadying, hardening into something resembling the stone around her. "You underestimated me." She zipped herself into the sleeping bag, the firelight flickering against the rough ceiling, and closed her eyes. Tomorrow, the real work of survival would begin. Sarah woke to a darkness so absolute it felt heavy, pressing against her eyelids like a physical weight. The air inside the cave had changed. The stagnant, dry cold of the previous evening had been replaced by a wet, biting draft that sliced right through the synthetic insulation of her sleeping bag. She fumbled in the pitch black, her stiff fingers struggling to find the cold metal cylinder of her maglite. When the beam finally cut through the gloom, the sight stole the breath from her lungs. The wind outside had shifted during the night. Instead of blowing past the limestone fissure, the Siberian Express was now driving directly into it. A massive snowdrift, standing nearly 4 feet high, had already encroached into the entryway of her sanctuary. The powdery white snow was creeping closer to her dead fire pit like a slow-moving glacier. If she didn't act, the storm would bury her alive inside her own shelter. Panic, sharp and metallic, spiked in her throat. She checked her Casio digital watch. It was 8:14 a.m. There was no morning light. The blizzard outside was a roaring, opaque wall of violent gray and white. Throwing off the sleeping bag, she instantly felt the brutal reality of the ambient temperature. It had to be at least 10 degrees below zero inside the cave. She was wearing her Patagonia base layers, a wool sweater, and her heavy coat, but the cold still found its way to her skin, stinging like a swarm of angry wasps. "Think, Sarah. Think," she muttered, her teeth clattering together violently. She needed to block the entrance, but she couldn't seal it completely. If she built another fire, which she desperately needed to do, carbon monoxide and smoke would quickly asphyxiate her in an airtight space. She needed a baffle wall, a barricade that would block the wind and snow but allow air circulation and smoke ventilation. She scrambled to her feet, her joints popping in protest. She grabbed her Morakniv carbon steel knife and her hatchet. The snowdrift was already packed hard by the wind. She used her hands and the flat side of the hatchet blade to aggressively scoop the snow back toward the entrance, building a packed berm. But snow wouldn't be enough. The wind would eventually erode it, or blow it right back in. She needed stone. The back of the cave, she had noticed the night before, was littered with loose limestone debris that had flaked off the ceiling over centuries. Sarah moved to the back wall and began hauling rocks. It was agonizing work. Some were the size of softballs. Others were heavy, jagged slabs that weighed 30 pounds or more. She hauled them to the entrance, stacking them atop the snow berm, her breath plumed in thick, ragged clouds. The muscles in her back and shoulders, already exhausted from the previous day's hike and wood gathering, began to spasm. Every time she stepped near the opening, the wind whipped her face with ice crystals that felt like ground glass. She worked for 3 unbroken hours. She built a curved, horseshoe-shaped wall about 4 feet high, positioned just inside the cave's lip. The curve was designed to deflect the howling wind, forcing it to swirl harmlessly outside rather than blasting into her living space. She left a gap of about 1.5 feet at the top for smoke to escape. To fill the cracks between the jagged rocks, she packed them tightly with snow and wet earth from the cave floor, creating a crude but effective mortar that froze solid within minutes. When the last rock was placed, Sarah collapsed against the inner side of her new barricade. The difference was immediate. The howling roar of the blizzard was instantly muffled, reduced to a frustrated hollow thumping against the exterior. The violent draft ceased. She crawled back to her sleeping area, her limbs trembling so violently she could barely control them. She had burned a dangerous amount of calories. She needed heat, and she needed it immediately. With agonizing slowness, she managed to strike a spark from her magnesium rod, igniting a small pile of pine needles. As the flames licked the wood, she huddled over it, uncaring as the smoke stung her eyes. The fire cast long, dancing shadows against her new stone wall. She had fortified her castle, but the victory was short-lived. The warmth of the fire brought a temporary, deceptive comfort. Sarah leaned back against the cave wall, wrapping the foil Coleman emergency blanket over her shoulders to reflect the fire's heat back onto her body. She closed her eyes, allowing the sheer exhaustion to drag her into a shallow, fitful sleep. She dreamt of the cabin. She dreamt of David, standing by the kitchen island, pouring steaming coffee into a ceramic mug. The smell of the roasted beans was so vivid, so real, she could almost taste the bitter warmth. She reached out for the mug, but David simply turned his back, pouring the scalding coffee down the sink as the kitchen walls dissolved into ice. Sarah snapped awake. The fire had burned down to glowing orange coals. The cold was creeping back in, but it wasn't the cold that had woken her. It was a sound, a distinct, rhythmic scratching. She held her breath, her hand slowly moving toward the Morkniv knife, resting by her hip. The sound stopped. Then, a soft, papery rustle came from the direction of her canvas rucksack, which she had leaned against the far wall of the cave. She clicked on her flashlight. The beam hit the backpack, illuminating a fat, gray shape perched atop the canvas. It was a bushy-tailed wood rat, a mountain pack rat. It froze in the harsh light, its black eyes reflecting the beam. "Hey!" Sarah shouted, her voice hoarse. She lunged forward, throwing a small stone at it. The rat squeaked and vanished into a microscopic fissure in the cave wall, lightning fast. Sarah scrambled over to her bag, the sense of dread settling heavy in her stomach. The rat hadn't just been exploring. She examined the top flap of the rucksack. The thick canvas had been chewed through, a jagged, frayed hole staring back at her. Her hands shaking, she unbuckled the straps and pulled the contents apart. Her first aid kit was intact. Her 2 remaining cans of kidney beans were untouched. But then her fingers found her water supply, a heavy-duty plastic Nalgene bottle. The rat had been drawn to the moisture. It had gnawed furiously at the soft plastic threading near the cap. The bottle had tipped over in the bag, and the integrity of the seal was completely destroyed. Sarah pulled the Nalgene out. It was shockingly light. She tipped it upside down. A pathetic, solitary drop of water fell onto the dusty cave floor. "No. No, no, no," she whispered, her voice cracking. She frantically checked the bottom of her rucksack. The thick canvas had absorbed the spill. Almost 32 ounces of life-saving water was gone, soaked into the fabric and already freezing into stiff, useless ice crystals. The reality of the situation crashed over her like a physical blow. You can survive for weeks without food, but only days without water. And in sub-zero temperatures, the dry winter air pulls moisture from your lungs with every breath you take. Dehydration happens faster in the freezing cold than it does in a desert. She looked toward the cave entrance. Beyond her stone barricade, an endless supply of water swirled in the violent storm. Snow. Millions of gallons of it. But eating raw snow was a death sentence. It would plummet her core body temperature, inviting hypothermia to take hold of her organs. It had to be melted. It had to be warmed. She looked at her supplies. She had no camping stove, no metal pot, no titanium cup. David had rushed her out so fast she hadn't been able to grab her mess kit. The only vessel she possessed was the empty aluminum can from the kidney beans she had eaten the night before. She picked up the empty tin can from the dirt. It was small, barely 15 ounces. Anger, hot and pure, flared in her chest, replacing the despair. David had done this. He had systematically stripped her of everything, calculating exactly what it would take for the mountain to finish her off. He had factored in the cold, the storm, the distance. Not today, she snarled at the empty air, her eyes burning with a fierce, defiant light. She grabbed the empty bean can and crawled toward the snow berm near the entrance. She packed the can full of the hard, icy powder. Returning to the fire ring, she carefully built up the flames, laying a flat stone near the edge of the coals to serve as a makeshift stove burner. She set the tin can on the hot stone. It would take 20 minutes to melt a single can of snow, yielding only about a third of a cup of actual drinkable water. It would taste of metallic tin, wood smoke, and the lingering starchy residue of kidney beans. She would have to repeat this agonizing process dozens of times a day just to stave off kidney failure. She watched the snow slowly, stubbornly begin to turn to slush at the bottom of the can. The storm raged outside, burying the world in white. But inside the dark belly of the mountain, Sarah Jenkins sat cross-legged, a tiny defiant speck of warmth, refusing to let her fire die. By the morning of the third day, the concept of time had dissolved into an agonizing loop of fire, snow, and smoke. The Siberian Express showed no signs of breaking. If anything, the barometric pressure had dropped further, evidenced by the dull, throbbing ache that had taken up permanent residence behind Sarah's eyes. Survival had become a brutal, suffocating mathematics. To stay alive, she needed a core body temperature of 98.6 degrees. To maintain that, she needed the fire. To feed the fire, she needed wood. To digest the cold kidney beans and stave off deadly dehydration, she needed water. To get water, she had to melt snow in her single 15-ounce tin can. It was a maddening cycle. Every hour, she crawled to her stone barricade, scooped the densely packed snow into the jagged rim of the can, and set it on the hot, flat stone beside the embers. It yielded a pathetic few gulps of lukewarm, metallic-tasting water. Her throat felt like it was lined with sandpaper, and her lips had cracked down the middle, bleeding sluggishly whenever she opened her mouth too wide. But the real crisis wasn't the water. It was the fuel. Sarah sat cross-legged on her bed of pine boughs, her knees pulled tightly to her chest beneath the thin Mylar emergency blanket. Her hands were shaking. She looked at her woodpile. The massive, chaotic mound of deadfall she had gathered in a panic on that first afternoon was nearly gone. Only a handful of damp, wrist-thick branches and a scattering of twigs remained. It was enough to keep a meager flame alive for perhaps 6 hours. After that, the ambient temperature of the cave, currently hovering around a lethal 10 degrees, would plunge. She coughed, a deep, rattling sound that tore at her chest. The smoke ventilation in the cave wasn't perfect. A thin, gray haze constantly hung near the ceiling, irritating her lungs and stinging her eyes, which were bloodshot and ringed with deep, bruised purple shadows. She unlaced her boots with stiff, clumsy fingers. It was a terrifying daily ritual. She peeled off 2 pairs of damp wool socks. Her toes were a stark, waxy white, the early stages of frostnip. If they turned blue, or worse, black, she would lose them. She desperately massaged her feet, forcing the sluggish blood back into the capillaries, biting back a whimper of pain as the nerves screamed back to life. "I have to get more wood," she croaked aloud, her voice sounding raspy and foreign in the cramped space. but stepping outside was a death sentence. The roar of the blizzard beyond her stone wall was a deafening, continuous freight train of sound. The wind would strip the heat from her body in minutes, and the whiteout conditions meant she could become hopelessly disoriented just 10 feet from the cave entrance. If she lost the cave, she would die in the snowdrift. She looked at her ex-fiancé's face in her mind's eye. David, sitting by the warm fireplace in Blackwood Ridge, likely sipping bourbon, utterly confident that the storm was doing his dirty work. He had timed it perfectly. The eviction, the dead truck, the incoming weather. It was a bloodless murder. A fresh surge of adrenaline, dark and bitter, flooded her system. The anger was a secondary heat source. She shoved her feet back into her boots and laced them tight. If she couldn't go out, she had to go in. When she had first claimed the cave, she had noted that the rear wall wasn't entirely solid. The chamber narrowed sharply into a tight, jagged fissure that vanished into absolute blackness. She had ignored it, prioritizing the fire and the entrance. But yesterday, while chasing the wood rat that had ruined her water supply, she had noticed a subtle, continuous draft pulling the fire's smoke toward that dark crevice. A draft meant airflow. Airflow meant space. And where there was space underground, there was occasionally dry debris, ancient roots, or old pack-rat middens dens made of twigs, dried vegetation, and bones that could burn like tinder. Sarah grabbed her maglite, her heavy carbon steel hatchet, and a blazing branch from the fire to use as a torch. She took a deep breath of the smoky air, steeled her nerves, and squeezed into the throat of the mountain. The fissure was terrifyingly narrow. The rough limestone tore at the nylon shell of her coat as she shuffled sideways, the heavy rock pressing against her chest and back. The darkness here was absolute, thick and heavy, swallowing the beam of her flashlight. Panic, primal and unreasoning, flared in her chest. If there's an earthquake, if the rock shifts even an inch, I will be crushed. I will be entombed. She forced herself to stop. She closed her eyes, focusing on the rhythmic, scraping sound of her own breathing. 1 foot in front of the other, she whispered. She shuffled forward. 10 feet. 20 feet. The passage began to slope downward, the air growing noticeably colder, smelling of undisturbed dust and rich, dry earth. Suddenly, the rock pressing against her back vanished. Sarah stumbled sideways, catching herself with her hands as her flashlight beam swung wildly across a new space. She stood up slowly, sweeping the light around. Her breath hitched. She had broken through into a secondary chamber, much larger than her primary shelter. The ceiling soared at least 15 feet high, adorned with tiny, dormant stalactites. But it wasn't the geology that made her heart pound against her ribs. It was the distinct, unmistakable geometry of human intervention. In the center of the dusty floor sat a wooden support beam, thick and heavily creosoted, bracing a fractured section of the ceiling. And leaning against the far wall were the remnants of a life long forgotten. Sarah stepped forward, her boots kicking up clouds of powdery dust that had likely lain undisturbed for decades. It was an old prospector's cache. The San Juan Mountains were riddled with them, remnants of the silver boom in the late 1800s. Miners would carve out exploratory adits, and when the veins dried up or the winters hit, they would abandon them, sometimes leaving heavy gear behind, rather than dragging it back down the treacherous passes. Her flashlight beam danced over the artifacts. There was a rusted, disintegrating pickaxe, its wooden handle entirely petrified. A stack of wooden dynamite crates, completely rotted through. And there, sitting atop a flat boulder like a holy grail, was a heavy, soot-stained, cast-iron Dutch oven with a matching lid. Sarah dropped to her knees in front of it, a hysterical sob escaping her cracked lips. A cast-iron pot. It was a 10-quart vessel. It meant she could boil gallons of snow at once. It meant pure, rolling, boiling water. It meant she could finally hydrate, cook the kidney beans properly, and fill her ruined Nalgene bottle with hot water to keep inside her sleeping bag for radiant heat. It was, quite literally, a heavy iron lifeline. She reached out with trembling, gloved hands and lifted the lid. The iron groaned. Inside the pot was a thick bundle of what looked like dark, waxy sticks, wrapped in heavy oilcloth canvas. She pulled one out and brought it to her nose. A sharp, intoxicating scent hit her pine resin, concentrated and potent. It was fatwood. the heartwood of a pine tree that had died standing up, its sap pooling and crystallizing in the stump over decades. It was nature's kerosene. Even a single stick, shaved down, could start a roaring fire in a monsoon. There were at least 20 sticks in the bundle. Beside the pot sat a small tarnished brass tin. Sarah pried it open with her thumbs. Inside, perfectly preserved in a bed of dry sawdust, was a glass vial containing friction matches and a folded piece of heavy parchment. She unfolded the paper carefully. The ink was faded, brown with age, written in a sprawling, elegant cursive. October 14th, 1898. The snow came early and hard. The mules froze on the pass, leaving the heavy gear. If a man finds this, take the iron, take the fire, but leave a prayer for Arthur Pendleton. The silver here is a ghost, and I fear I am soon to be one as well. Sarah stared at the century-old handwriting. Arthur Pendleton had stood in this exact spot, defeated by the very same mountains, the very same cold that was currently trying to claim her. But Arthur had surrendered. He had left his gear and walked out into the white death. Sarah carefully folded the note and put it in her breast pocket. "I won't leave a prayer, Arthur," she whispered into the freezing dark. "But I'll make sure your fire doesn't go out." She grabbed the heavy cast-iron pot, tucking the fat wood and the matches securely inside, and wrapped her arms around the freezing metal. It weighed easily 20 pounds, a monumental burden for her exhausted muscles, but she didn't care. The trip back through the tight fissure was agonizing. The iron pot scraped against the limestone, threatening to wedge her tight, but she pushed through with a manic, feral strength. When she finally burst back into the primary chamber, the dim, dying orange glow of her fire was the most beautiful sight in the world. She set the iron pot down with a heavy clank. She grabbed her hatchet, shaved down a small pile of the newly discovered fat wood, and struck a single match from Arthur's brass tin. The fat wood caught instantly, burning with a thick, furious black smoke and an intense, localized heat. She piled her remaining damp wood on top. Within minutes, the damp wood was hissing, popping, and catching fire, fueled by the relentless heat of the resin. Sarah crawled to the entrance, packed the massive cast-iron Dutch oven with snow, and hauled it back to the roaring fire. She set it directly onto the coals. As the snow began to melt, turning into a vast, glorious pool of water, Sarah sat back. Her muscles ached, her skin was raw, and the blizzard outside continued its violent assault. But as the firelight danced off the black iron of her new prize, a profound shift occurred within her. She was no longer just a victim of David's cruelty, merely hiding in a hole waiting to freeze. She had water. She had fire. She was adapting. David Caldwell had cast her out to die in the storm. But he hadn't realized that when you back someone into the darkest corner of the earth, sometimes they don't surrender to the dark. Sometimes they find iron. The heavy cast-iron lid rattled with a glorious, rhythmic clatter as the water inside finally reached a rolling boil. To Sarah Jenkins, that sound was a symphony. It was the sound of defying the impossible. She used her leather gloves, stiff and cracked from the cold, to carefully drag the 10-quart Dutch oven off the hottest coals and onto a flat slab of limestone. Steam billowed into the frigid air of the cave, thick and pure. For the first time in nearly 4 days, she hovered her face over the rising vapor, closing her eyes as the wet heat penetrated the dry, cracked skin of her cheeks and thawed the frozen mucus in her nasal passages. She breathed it in deeply, a ragged sigh escaping her chest. She let the water cool just enough so it wouldn't blister her mouth, then dipped her aluminum bean can into the pot. She drank. The water tasted of ancient iron, wood smoke, and a faint, metallic tang, but it was the sweetest thing she had ever consumed. She drank until her stomach ached, feeling the warmth radiate outward from her core, chasing the icy dread from her veins. With her hydration secured, Sarah turned her attention to the rest of Arthur Pendleton's century-old cache. The fat wood had saved her fire, but the resin-soaked sticks would burn out quickly if she used them as her primary fuel source. She needed bulk timber. Taking a burning branch for light, she squeezed back through the narrow limestone fissure into the secondary chamber. Now that she wasn't operating in a state of blind panic, she could evaluate the space more clearly. The old prospector's adit went deeper into the mountain, but the air grew stale and heavy the further back she shined her maglite, warning of bad air, a lethal pocket of carbon dioxide or methane common in old mines. She wouldn't venture past the wooden support beam. However, scattered around that beam were the remnants of Arthur's broken dreams. 3 shattered dynamite crates, several lengths of thick splintered pine shoring, and a heavy wooden wheelbarrow, its iron wheel rusted solid. The wood was bone dry, having sat in the humidity-free, freezing environment for over 120 years. It was perfectly seasoned firewood. For the next 6 hours, Sarah worked with a methodical, singular focus. She used her hatchet to break apart the crates and splinter the wheelbarrow. It was exhausting labor, her muscles screaming with lactic acid, but the fear of freezing was a powerful motivator. She dragged the timber back into her primary cave, stacking it neatly against the wall. By nightfall of the 4th day, her shelter had transformed. The roaring fire illuminated a space that no longer felt like a tomb, but a stronghold. She had poured her last can of kidney beans into the boiling water, creating a hot, starchy broth that gave her a much-needed injection of calories. She had even filled her punctured Nalgene bottle with hot water, keeping it upright in her sleeping bag, to act as a radiant heater against her freezing toes. She sat back against the rock, chewing on a softened bean, and stared at the dancing flames. "You thought you were so smart, David," she murmured, the sound of her own voice keeping the crushing isolation at bay. She pictured him back at Blackwood Ridge. He was meticulous, calculating. He had probably already boxed up the few belongings she had left behind, ready to erase her entirely from the narrative of his life. He had underestimated her resilience. He had viewed her kindness as weakness. But as she sat there, wrapped in a mylar blanket, smelling of smoke and unwashed sweat, Sarah realized something profound. The woman who had cried on the porch of the cabin 4 days ago was dead. The mountain had stripped her down to her base elements, burning away the grief and the shock, leaving only a hardened, diamond-sharp will to survive. She would walk out of this mountain. She would walk straight into the sheriff's office in Silverton, and she would make David Caldwell answer for what he had done. But the mountain wasn't finished with her yet. As she drifted into a deep, exhausted sleep, her body finally warm, a microscopic enemy she had ignored during her frantic scramble for life, was silently multiplying. Sarah woke abruptly, her body seized by a violent, uncontrollable shivering that rattled her teeth and sent dull spikes of pain shooting up her spine. She threw off the sleeping bag, thoroughly confused. The fire she had built from Arthur Pendleton's ancient mine timber was still burning brightly, a steady, roaring blaze of seasoned wood that cast a deep, comforting orange glow across the limestone walls. The ambient temperature of the cave was the warmest it had been in 4 days, easily hovering in the low 50s. Yet, she felt as though she had been plunged naked into a glacial lake. A wave of intense nausea hit her, accompanied by a dizzying, suffocating heat that seemed to radiate outward from her own organs. She pressed a trembling, dirt-caked hand to her forehead. Her skin was a furnace, slick with a sickly cold sweat. "No," she gasped, her breath coming in shallow, rapid pants that scraped against her dry throat. "Not now. Please, not now." She tried to push herself up into a sitting position, to reach for the cast-iron pot of water. But the moment she engaged the muscles in her right leg, a blinding, white-hot agony shot from her shin straight into her hip. The pain was so sudden and severe that it robbed her of breath, forcing a strangled cry from her cracked lips as she collapsed backward onto the bed of pine boughs. Panting heavily, her vision swimming with black spots, she reached down and frantically rolled up the right leg of her heavy thermal underwear. Just below the knee, the jagged laceration she had sustained on the very first afternoon, when she had slipped on the icy scree field while scrambling up to the cave, stared back at her. In the chaotic, terrifying blur of surviving the freezing temperatures, battling the dehydration, and building the stone barricade, she had completely ignored the cut. She had foolishly assumed the sub-zero environment would act as a natural cryotherapy, keeping any bacteria dormant. She had been disastrously wrong. The laceration was now a swollen, angry mass of ruined tissue. The edges of the wound had turned a sickly, necrotic purple, surrounded by a terrifying hot halo of deep red. Worse still, faint but distinct crimson lines were tracking upward from the wound, branching out toward the lymph nodes in her thigh, like a sinister, creeping roadmap. The skin was unnaturally tight and boiling hot to the touch, and a foul, sweet odor of decay emanated from the split flesh. Sepsis. The silent, merciless killer of the deep wilderness. Panic, far worse and far more primal than the fear of the blizzard outside, seized her by the throat. Hypothermia was at least a slow, sleepy death, a quiet, fading into the cold. But a systemic blood infection was a violent, agonizing descent into madness, as the organs shut down one by one. She had her small first aid kit, but it contained only a few flimsy adhesive bandages, 3 small alcohol prep pads, and a half-empty blister pack of ibuprofen. She had no broad-spectrum antibiotics. She had nothing designed to fight a raging infection that was already establishing a beachhead in her bloodstream. Delirium, fueled by the spiking fever, began to fray the edges of her reality. The dancing shadows cast by the fire seemed to stretch and contort along the cave walls, morphing into tall, looming figures. She blinked hard, trying to clear her vision, but the shadows coalesced into the shape of David Caldwell. He was standing by her stone barricade, wearing his expensive cashmere coat, holding a crystal tumbler of amber bourbon. He was smiling that patronizing cold smile, the same one he wore when he handed her the eviction notice. "You were always so careless, Sarah," the hallucination seemed to whisper, the voice blending perfectly with the howling wind outside. "I told you wouldn't last a week without me. Get out." She slurred at the empty air, her head thrashing against the hard rock. She squeezed her eyes shut, fighting to ground herself in reality. She could not let him win. She could not die in this hole. She had to act. And she had to act with a brutal, medieval efficiency. Or she would be dead before the sun rose. Dragging herself toward her canvas rucksack, groaning through clenched teeth with every excruciating inch, she retrieved her Morkniv knife and the tiny bottle of alcohol pads. Then, her fever-addled brain remembered the heavy cast-iron pot sitting near the coals. Inside was the bundle of fatwood from Arthur's century-old cache. She remembered reading once, in a battered wilderness survival manual years ago, that raw pine resin pitch possessed natural, highly potent antibacterial and antimicrobial properties. Native American tribes and early pioneers had utilized the sticky sap for centuries to draw out deep infections, seal severe wounds, and stop hemorrhaging. It was a desperate, horrific gamble, but it was the only card she had left to play. She pulled a thick stick of the dark, waxy fatwood from the bundle. Holding it perilously close to the hottest coals of the fire, she let the intense, radiant heat melt the concentrated, amber-colored sap. It began to bubble, turning into a thick, scalding, viscous liquid that smelled sharply of concentrated turpentine and deep forest. Sarah gritted her teeth until her jaw popped. She found a thick, splintered piece of pine shoring from the wheelbarrow, placed it horizontally between her teeth, and bit down hard to protect her tongue. She tore open an alcohol prep pad. Her hands were shaking so violently she nearly dropped it. Taking a deep, ragged breath of the smoky air, she viciously scrubbed the infected wound. She didn't just wipe it. She dug into the flesh, tearing away the dead, necrotic skin to expose the festering, infected tissue beneath. A ragged, animalistic scream tore from her throat, muffled only by the wood clamped between her teeth. The pain was absolute, a blinding, localized starburst behind her eyes that threatened to rip her consciousness away. Tears streamed down her soot-stained, dirt-streaked face in hot, heavy tracks. But she couldn't stop. With her left hand, she grabbed the stick of melting fatwood. With her right hand gripping her thigh to keep the leg still, she positioned the bubbling pitch directly over the open, raw laceration. She let the scalding sap drip. The moment the boiling pitch hit the open nerve endings, the world simply ceased to exist. It was an overload of sensory agony so profound that the human brain simply could not process it. The scream she let out splintered the wood in her mouth. Her back arched off the ground, her muscles locking in a rigid, terrifying spasm of pure torment. And then, mercifully, a heavy, suffocating blackness rushed in like a tidal wave, sweeping her under and dragging her away from the pain. When Sarah finally opened her eyes again, the world was completely still. The roaring fire had burned down to a sprawling pile of soft, ghostly gray ash, save for one stubborn, glowing red ember in the center. She lay perfectly flat on the dirt floor, her limbs splayed awkwardly. Her body felt astonishingly heavy, hollowed out, as if her bones had been replaced with lead. She waited in the gloom for the throbbing agony in her leg, bracing herself for the heat of the sepsis. The pain was certainly there, a dull, deep, angry ache that throbbed in time with her heartbeat, but the terrifying radiating furnace that had consumed her entire body was gone. Her clothes were entirely soaked through with a cold, rank sweat that smelled of illness. The fever had broken. She propped herself up on one elbow, her head swimming with a dizzying wave of vertigo. She looked down at her leg. The wound was covered in a hard, black, glossy shell of dried pine pitch. The red tracking lines of sepsis had faded to a dull, bruised pink. The crude, agonizing poultice had worked just enough to hold the bacteria back, giving her exhausted immune system a fighting chance. She slowly pushed herself up into a sitting position and reached for the iron pot. She drank greedily, the cold water soothing her parched throat, washing away the metallic taste of blood where she had bitten her lip. As the fog of the fever fully cleared from her mind, she sat in the dim light of the cave and noticed something profoundly strange. Something massive was missing from the environment. It took her exhausted brain several long minutes to identify the absence. It wasn't a physical object, it was the sound. For 5 days and 4 endless nights, the roar of the Siberian Express had been a constant, deafening companion. It had been a shrieking, howling, malevolent entity that continuously tried to claw its way through her stone barricade, vibrating the very bedrock of the mountain. Now, there was only a vast, ringing, heavy silence. Sarah crawled slowly toward the entrance of the cave, her right leg dragging stiffly behind her, the hardened pitch pulling at her skin. She reached the inner curve of her stone baffle wall, placed her hands on the cold limestone rocks, and carefully pulled herself up to peer over the top. The snowdrift outside had completely buried the lower half of the cave entrance, climbing nearly 5 feet high. But above the crest of the drift, the view was entirely unobstructed. The blizzard had finally stopped. The heavy, oppressive ceiling of bruised purple and violent gray clouds had shattered. In their place was a sky of such piercing, brilliant, uninterrupted blue that it made her light-sensitive eyes ache. The morning sun was rising over the jagged peaks of the San Juan Mountains, casting a blinding, golden, crystalline light across a world that had been completely and utterly transformed. The rugged terrain, the sharp pine trees, the steep, treacherous ravine, everything had been erased, buried beneath an unbroken, undulating ocean of 6 feet of pristine, untouched powder. It was a silent, frozen, deadly paradise. The storm was over. The Siberian Express had moved on, but as Sarah looked out at the vast, impassable white desert that separated her high-altitude sanctuary from the safety of civilization, she felt a new, cold reality settle over her. The mountain had failed to freeze her, the infection had failed to kill her, but she was miles from help, and the snow was too deep to walk through. She had survived the cave. Now, she had to find a way to conquer the snow. Stepping into 6 feet of fresh, uncompacted powder, without flotation, was a physical impossibility. If Sarah simply walked out of the cave, she would sink to her chest, expend all her remaining calories struggling for a single yard, and die of exhaustion before noon. She retreated into the smoky warmth of the cave. She needed snowshoes. Her eyes fell on the ruined canvas rucksack that the wood rat had chewed through. She took her Morakniv knife and ruthlessly sliced the thick, olive-drab material into long, durable strips. Next, she gathered the sturdiest, most flexible green pine boughs she had used for her bed. Weaving the branches into 2 large, teardrop-shaped loops, she lashed them tightly together using the canvas strips and the nylon drawstring from her sleeping bag. They were crude, heavy, and ugly, but when she strapped them to her boots and tested her weight on the snow berm, she sank only to her calves. They would hold. Before leaving, Sarah filled her belly with the last of the boiled water, packed her hatchet, the remaining fat wood, and Arthur Pendleton's brass match tin into her coat pockets. She left the heavy cast-iron pot sitting on the stone hearth. It belonged to the mountain. It belonged to Arthur. The descent was an agonizing exercise in sheer willpower. The morning sun, reflecting off millions of pristine snow crystals, created a blinding glare that seared her retinas. She had to rip a strip of dark fabric from her thermal shirt and tie it over her eyes, cutting small slits to peer through, preventing snow blindness. Every step sent a jolt of sickening pain up her right leg. The pine pitch poultice had stopped the infection from reaching her bloodstream, but the tissue was still damaged and highly inflamed. She moved like a wounded animal, a slow, rhythmic dragon step through the silent, frozen cathedral of the San Juan Pines. By her estimation, it took her 4 hours to cover the steep mile down the ravine to where the main asphalt road should have been. The road itself was completely invisible, erased by a massive, smooth ribbon of white drift. She only knew she had found it by the unnatural clearing between the trees and the faint tops of the wooden guardrails peeking through the snow. She turned south toward Silverton, leaning heavily into the biting wind that had begun to pick up again. 2 miles down the invisible road, her crude snowshoes dragging heavily, Sarah saw something that made her freeze. 50 yards ahead, half buried in a massive snowbank off the shoulder of the road, was a vehicle. It wasn't a snowplow or a search and rescue tracked vehicle. It was a black 2023 Chevy Silverado, David's truck. Sarah's breath hitched in her chest. She approached slowly, her hand instinctively dropping to the handle of the hatchet at her belt. The truck had clearly hit a patch of black ice before the snow had fully accumulated, sliding sideways and smashing its front axle into the hidden granite ditch. The snowfall had then buried it up to the windows. The engine was dead. The exhaust pipe was plugged solid with ice. She reached the driver's side window and wiped away a thick layer of frost with her gloved hand. Inside, huddled in a posture of absolute defeat, was David Caldwell. He was wearing his expensive cashmere overcoat, utterly useless against sub-zero conditions. His face was a ghastly, mottled blue, his lips cracked and bleeding. The interior of the truck was covered in a thin layer of hoarfrost from his own freezing breath. He was severely hypothermic, teetering on the very edge of unconsciousness. Sarah stared at him. The man who had meticulously calculated her death had been undone by his own panic. He had likely lost power at the cabin, realized the generator was out of fuel, and tried to flee the mountain before the storm peaked, only to wreck his prized truck. The irony was so potent it tasted metallic on her tongue. David's eyelids fluttered open. His glazed, bloodshot eyes locked onto the figure standing outside his window. Through the frosted glass, Sarah looked like an apparition. Her face was smeared with black soot and dried pine pitch. Her clothes were torn, her eyes fierce and burning through the slits of her makeshift blindfold. She looked like the wrath of the mountain made flesh. David recoiled, a pathetic, raspy whimper escaping his throat. He thought she was a ghost. He thought the woman he had murdered had come back to drag him to hell. Sarah looked down at the passenger seat. Sitting on top of his leather briefcase, clearly hastily grabbed on his way out, was a thick manila folder. Even through the glass, she could read the bold, black lettering of the life insurance company's logo. He hadn't just evicted her. He had ensured that when her body was found in the spring thaw, he would collect a $500,000 payout. A cold, absolute fury settled over her. She could walk away. She could leave him to the fate he had designed for her. It would take less than 2 hours for his heart to stop. The mountain would keep the secret. Instead, Sarah unhooked the carbon steel hatchet from her belt. She swung it backward and drove the blunt hammer end into the tempered glass of the rear passenger window. The glass shattered with a deafening crack. David screamed, a weak, reedy sound, trying to press himself into the driver's door. Sarah reached through the shattered window, unlocked the door, and hauled it open. The smell of fear, stale sweat, and freezing leather poured out. She ignored him completely. She leaned across the console, grabbed the microphone of his emergency CB radio, and clicked it to Channel 9. Mayday, Mayday. This is Sarah Jenkins. I am on Highway 550, approximately 8 miles north of Silverton. I have a vehicular accident with one male occupant suffering from severe hypothermia. Static crackled, and then a shocked voice broke through. Copy, Sarah Jenkins? This is Silverton Dispatch. We have active search parameters for that corridor. Stay on the line. Snowcat units are mobilizing. Sarah dropped the microphone. She picked up the life insurance folder from the passenger seat and tucked it safely inside her heavy coat. She finally looked directly at David. He was shaking violently, his teeth chattering, staring at her with a mixture of absolute terror and profound confusion. Why? He croaked, his voice barely a whisper. Why are you? Because I am not you, Sarah said, her voice like crushed ice. And because dead men can't go to prison, she reached into her pocket, pulled out a single resin-soaked stick of Arthur Pendleton's fatwood, and tossed it onto his lap. "Hold on to that," she whispered. "It's the only warmth you're going to get." She turned her back on the black truck, adjusted her makeshift snowshoes, and began walking south. She didn't look back, not even when the distant, heavy rumble of the county search and rescue snowcats began to echo through the canyon. The mountain had tried to break her, but it had only forged her into iron, and iron doesn't break. Sarah Jenkins did not merely survive the Siberian Express, she conquered it. Her emergence from the whiteout made national headlines. But the true victory happened quietly in a Silverton courtroom 6 months later. The life insurance documents, coupled with the forensic evidence from the cabin and the truck, sealed David Caldwell's fate. Convicted of attempted murder and insurance fraud, he was sentenced to 20 years in a federal penitentiary. Sarah never returned to Blackwood Ridge. She used the settlement money from David's seized assets to buy a small, sturdy plot of land at the base of the San Juans. In her living room, resting proudly on the mantel above a roaring fire, sits a soot-stained, century-old cast-iron pot. It serves as a permanent, silent reminder. When the world casts you out into the freezing dark, you do not surrender. You simply build a better fire.